Governor, thank you. It's great to be here. I've been in Wyoming many times, and this is not my first trip to Gillette. I'm really glad to be back. I want to start by thanking the governor, and we talked about this the last time I was in Wyoming. There's not enough bipartisan leadership in the country today, and I feel a certain sort of kinship with the governor because I'm a climate advocate and I'm a Democrat, but thank you. But I'm also from North Dakota, as the governor said, and I grew up in a community where people worked at the coal mines and the power plants, more recently in the oil and gas fields. And I have family that, have a farm background, and I myself spent 20 years taking a stab at ranching. So even though I'm a climate advocate, I come to this very much tied to people in communities who earn their living in some way or another from the land. And we're not going to succeed at meeting this climate challenge if we don't do it in ways that work for people in places like Wyoming and North Dakota. And the approach, Governor, that you're taking is really needed right now, of trying to, frankly, reframe the climate challenge, make it about emissions, about technology, about pathways to getting to zero, that retool industries to continue to support the livelihoods and communities that depend on those industries rather than transitioning away from them. I even confess to being a bit uncomfortable with the energy transition language, not because we don't need a transition, we do, but it's heard as a transition away from my job, my community, my industry. And if that's the price for success in tackling climate change, then we won't meet the mark. And the other thing I just want to acknowledge, and this may seem like a small thing, but it's not, just having a Western Governors Association chair's agenda on carbon management in and of itself is a huge sign of progress. I've been engaging with Western Governors Association at least for a decade, and it's a great organization for bringing people together and making progress on energy and environment, climate. But the legitimacy that comes with actually having a chair's agenda is really a great step forward. Thank you for that. I'm just going to give a kind of a quick overview, and then what I want to do is leave real time for questions and answers. And there are a number of people I should just also note that are in the audience here who have played really foundational roles in helping us as a country to get to where we're at in carbon management. And you know who you are. I'm not going to try to name all of you because I don't want to miss anyone, but I just want to recognize that this is the other great thing about Wyoming, and it's not appreciated nationally in the way it should be, is that Wyoming is a real place of innovation and new ideas, and it's been very exciting to see the evolution in the state for some time now. So let me just quickly talk about our portfolio. I sometimes refer to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management as the sleeper office in the federal government. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but just take a look at what we work on. We have the government's portfolio for carbon management. That's the whole value chain of capturing CO2 emissions from industrial facilities and power plants, increasingly converting captured carbon emissions into useful products. The Integrated Test Center is an example of that effort. Looking ahead more and more, the commercialization of technology to capture and remove CO2 from the atmosphere directly. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, building out the whole infrastructure of CO2 transport and storage region by region so that carbon capture and storage is not just an accident of geography, that every industry has the option to capture and manage their emissions by being able to tap into an existing system of CO2 transport and storage. So that's the carbon management side. And then we also have the traditional fossil energy portfolio for the federal government. We authorize U.S. exports of liquefied natural gas. So I never imagined that in this job I would spend most of my spare time, to the extent that I have it, on natural gas. But since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our office has really been at the center of a whole effort to ensure global energy security. U.S. natural gas in the world today is playing a critical role, and safeguarding European democracy, economic stability in East Asia, and a whole lot of other things. We also work on methane mitigation, and that's the increasing part of our portfolio. That's domestic and it's international. We do have research and development in methane mitigation, about $60 million a year, so it's a critical portfolio. Work very closely with industry. We also have an important international dimension to methane mitigation. I'm actually co-chairing a global work group of 18 countries, importers and exporters of natural gas, trying to reach agreement on how we together can measure the greenhouse gas intensity of the natural gas we produce and export. So that's just then finally, this is really important for Wyoming, very important for the nation, critical minerals. That's not the topic of today, but we're focused very intensely on trying to develop new sources of critical minerals and rare earth elements, both the production and the processing. And also we're going to be launching a Mine of the Future research and development program so that we can have mining technologies, bring our research, development, and demonstration to mining technologies in the same way we've done so successfully with clean energy technologies, so that mines in the future will have a dramatically reduced environmental and climate footprint. That's just a little bit of the overview. And I'll just say, and I'll get to this more later, increasingly we're trying to do all of this, putting communities and stakeholders first. And we've all seen with project development, the growing challenges, even opposition to projects. And it's not just projects related to fossil energy, it's also renewables. And it's not just in the Gulf Coast, it's states like my own. I'll just share a quick anecdote. I was home to my ranch 4 weeks ago. And as I visited with my rancher neighbors. And we have 500 megawatts of wind on our ridge. And they don't want any more wind energy development. They're just done. Then they started off as advocates of wind energy. That didn't surprise me. That's been evolving over the years. What surprised me is some of my neighbors are also organizing against the siting of a CO2 pipeline. So that tells you something new is at work in the country, and it doesn't fall neatly along regional or ideological lines. And so we really need to think carefully about how we engage communities and stakeholders as we deploy this technology and infrastructure. So we have, we're guided by a number of goals. President Biden has established a goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. We're hopeful that the combined impact of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure legislation can get us to about a 40% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030. So still more to do, but it's a big down payment. It gets harder. The 2035 goal is zero emissions in the power sector, and we can talk about some of the technologies that can contribute to that. And then the goal of all goals, of course, is net zero emissions by 2050. We're contributing in different ways to all these goals. I'll just mention here the carbon negative shot is a goal that relates to carbon dioxide removal. And that's a research, development, and demonstration goal where by investing our dollars with the public sector, we hope to drive down the cost of removing a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere to $100 per metric ton by 2030. That's a hugely ambitious goal, but vitally important for the future. I don't think I need, with this audience, to spend a lot of time on this slide, but it's the whole ecosystem or the whole value chain. It's not just carbon capture, and that's for those of us who've been involved in this field for many years. That's been the big challenge: is how do you address the big chicken and egg problem? If you have a power plant or an industrial facility, you want to capture and store your CO2 emissions, you're not going to put capital at risk unless you know that you've got a pipeline and a CO2 storage site that's either is there and available, or is that you're confident that it's going to be there. And same problem if you're developing geologic storage. Why would you take those steps if you're not confident that there's going to be a supply of CO2 and people willing to pay for the service of geologic storage? So with the infrastructure legislation in particular, but also the Inflation Reduction Act, we're doing the best we can to try to advance this whole value chain simultaneously and get past that chicken and egg problem. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I think you are all very engaged in applying for the various provisions in the infrastructure bill and ultimately take advantage of the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. But just very quickly, for a refresh, it's the largest investment in energy and climate of any country in the world. It's $62 billion over 5 years to the Department of Energy alone. $12 billion for carbon management. It goes up to 20 if you include the hydrogen component, some of which involves carbon capture and storage. What's exciting is with the 2020 Energy Act, which Senator Barrasso played a significant role in, excuse me, we not only authorized a lot of these provisions, but for the first time, DOE was given the authority to significantly expand beyond research and development to prioritize also supporting commercial scale demonstration of technologies and deployment of infrastructure. And so it's not just the amount of money, it's our ability to expend those dollars in a strategic and comprehensive way. I would just also note in the Inflation Reduction Act, we're not really sure what the value of that is in terms of tax credits. It will ultimately depend on the uptake of the tax credits in the marketplace, but it's at least $350 to $400 billion worth of tax credits. It could be much higher than that in the end. Here's some key things about that. Those tax credits are available for 10 years for any project beginning construction between now and the end of 2032. We've never had an planning and investment horizon of that length, and it's a huge stimulus to private capital. I think you're all familiar with the 45Q tax credit. I think it's going to be very critical to the future of this state. $85 per ton from power plants and industrial facilities for capturing and storing the CO2, $60 per ton if you're storing the CO2 through enhanced oil recovery, goes up to $180 a ton for direct air capture because it's a nascent technology. Again, these are the overall numbers, just again, on CO2 transport and storage. I can't resist. I got to do one shout out here, and John's smiling, knows it's going to be him. There are some people in this country that have played an enormous role in CO2 transport and storage, and our loss is your gain. We lost John from our team, John Latinsky, at the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. He's now working here in Wyoming, but he has played a huge role over the years in building out the Department of Energy. And I can say this because I've only been involved a year and a half, so it's not bragging. The Department of Energy has the most sophisticated program for CO2 storage and increasingly CO2 transport in the world. And it's what, John, about 25 years old now? Give or take? 20? Okay. And it just got a huge boost in the infrastructure bill. Basically, between transport and storage, $5 billion over 5 years. And John and team, formerly on the team, have a strategy of supporting the build out of 20 to 40 regional geologic storage hubs over the time period of this legislation. And each of those hubs storing 50 million tons of CO2 over 30 years at a minimum. Many will store much, much more. So I think that's just very exciting. And then there's, on the technology demonstration side, $2.5 billion for commercial scale carbon capture demos. That's 2 for coal-based generation, 2 for natural gas power plants, and 2 for industrial facilities. And then there's a $6 billion plus program in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration for industrial decarbonization more broadly. It includes carbon capture, but all the other things we need to just decarbonize industries. And then carbon dioxide removal. Many of you saw the announcements last month, $1.2 billion, the first 2 of what will be 4 regional direct air capture hubs. This is taking the technology from 4,000 tons a year in Iceland to 1 million tons per year. And there's already a 500 million ton project under construction in Texas. So the United States really is leading the world in the commercialization of this technology. Wyoming is also engaging significantly. In addition to the 2 regional hub awards, there were 19 awards for engineering studies and pre-feasibility studies. Wyoming won one of those awards. I don't remember whether it was FEED or feasibility, but Wyoming is participating. We have Native Alaskan projects. We have projects in Southern California, in Florida. The geography of carbon management, this is the other really exciting thing. it's not just Wyoming and North Dakota anymore. It's really the whole country. And that is so long overdue. And it was so exciting. I don't play a role as assistant secretary in making funding decisions. I get the briefing when the selections had been made. And there was no one happier in the Department of Energy that day when I saw the geography of all these selections. It's just really spanning the country. That's so urgently needed. Here you start to see sort of more of a regional focus. There are 83 projects that we're funding in the Western U.S., 18 in carbon storage, 2 for pipeline feed studies. Again, 13 of the 21 direct air capture projects are in the West. And then as far as pre-feed and feed studies for different technologies, 50 in the Western region. So that's the other thing I would say. Even if the Inflation Reduction Act passed with only Democratic votes, and Governor, you and I have talked about this, all those provisions, almost all of them, not all, most of those provisions have bipartisan roots. The infrastructure bill was fully bipartisan. And what we're seeing is the implementation. This is very important to me personally, is the implementation of this legislation in terms of the projects selected are really span the country. So energy producing and industrial states have been doing very, very well in terms of having projects selected to date. Here's just a slide. Obviously, tribal communities are vital here in the West, and I'm only sharing this because we happen to do this work for an upcoming dialogue we're going to have with Western tribes in New Mexico beginning of October. And what we did is we looked at facilities eligible for the 45Q tax credit and how they overlay with tribal lands. So that's a great opportunity as well. Class 6 permitting. This is where we need to do better as a federal government. You have, Governor mentioned delegated authority, as North Dakota does, the first 2 states. Louisiana, fingers crossed, should have it. I'm hoping in this spring, and everything I'm hearing is that Texas is applying, Oklahoma is applying, Colorado as well. Todd, am I right that Colorado is going to apply for Class 6? California, I'm told, is indicated they will do it. Its point is more and more states are wanting to submit the applications and be able to take over that authority to do the federal Class 6 permitting at the state level. That will address what I think is a huge problem, and that's that with the incentives and funding that we have in this national legislation, it's supercharging deployment and project development, and that's getting ahead of our capacity to permit. I just checked with EPA here. We had a briefing with EPA leadership a few weeks ago. They were at over 150 Class 6 permits as of 3-4 weeks ago. I'm sure it's more than that now. It's just another indicator of the uptake. I also was in New York at Climate Week yesterday, meeting with colleagues at the Clean Air Task Force, and they are tracking new carbon management projects in the United States that have been only the projects that have been publicly announced. And their online tracker is now at 190 projects across the country. So the permitting, the way I talk about it is we need to bring permitting to climate scale. If carbon management is going to fulfill its potential contribution to addressing our climate goals, then we've got to be able to permit the projects. One of the things that we're doing in addition to supporting EPA and companies and applicants, we're actually providing federal lab staff from the DOE labs, engineers and scientists to work with EPA to actually support the specific work on the permits themselves. The community part of this, so at the start of the administration, a commitment was made to invest our funding from Congress in projects differently with respect to communities. And there's a philosophical component to this, no doubt, and I'm actually personally very supportive of that. But there's also a practical component to this. I talked about the challenges of project development. We have to, as a department, we have to rethink how we work with communities and stakeholders, but states and local governments do as well, and in particular companies developing projects. It's no longer works to come with a fully baked project, do a public meeting and say, this is what we want to do, and expect the community, whatever community, to support you. There has to be a lot more front-end work to make sure that community concerns and interests are not just listened to, but actually affect the design of projects. That's a big change over how things have been done historically. So in the projects that we are funding, and some of you in the room know this, and I understand it's burdensome, I'll be the first to acknowledge that, we're asking project applicants to develop community development plans that have a community engagement, diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental justice, and this is especially important, workforce development components. And we are now applying about 20% of the overall weighting, scoring of projects to the work that's done in this area that we call the community benefits package. And then when we make selections in the negotiation of the awards, if we think there were weaknesses on the community benefit side, we're going to work with those applicants to try to improve that. And then when we make the awards, and we're now just getting to this part of the process, we're going to be monitoring to make sure that they're actually delivering on that community part. But it isn't just an ideological imposition, it's a real recognition that if we're only going to achieve these levels of deployment and reach the full potential that this legislation offers if we have widespread community acceptance of projects and infrastructure. And I think I'm at the end. Well, one example, we're really trying to engage the Western tribes. Here in 2 weeks, we're going to have the third tribal leaders dialogue since I've been in the job. And honestly, in the spirit of community engagement, we go and we sit down with tribal leadership for 2 days, and we mostly listen. Very few presentations, and we're starting to actually act on recommendations they're making. We want to stand up an advisory group of tribal leaders to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. We're going to hire tribal liaisons. We're not sure how to divide the West yet, but we're going to do that because there's all kinds of opportunities for tribal communities in this legislation, but they don't necessarily even know what those opportunities are or have the capacity to apply it. So we're trying to rethink how we provide that support. Which to divide it up. Well, it's more of a practical consideration of how to, and then regional, and we're also retooling how we provide technical assistance. Many of you are familiar with what started off as the regional carbon sequestration partnerships. Those was really important early work to both do R&D on geologic storage, but also increase the comfort level and understanding among stakeholders and state governments about carbon storage. That's now evolving into our directly funding organizations and consulting firms and state geologic surveys and so forth to provide direct technical assistance to actual geologic basin regions to help with support deployment and project development. And so you see here the map of our recent awards. I'm also very excited about this. The West is doing very well here, but we also are starting to get to offshore. You see the Mid-Atlantic. That's the one area where the United States is not a leader in carbon management is offshore. Norway and I think Brazil arguably are in the lead there, but we want to catch up. And so I was very excited to see, we also have there in Alaska, which is very important, the Cook Inlet there. So wherever we can, we're trying to retool how we do things as well. Yeah. And so those are just some examples of the things we're doing. And I probably went more than 10 minutes. I apologize for that. I'll leave those links up. I'm assuming the presentations will be sent to everybody, but at least you can see where to find more information. And I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any and all questions. No questions are off limits.
No. They are working. All right. Well, Brad, because we have such a shy group here, I have a couple of questions. First and foremost, I'm really delighted to have you here and your background. Having that agricultural background, I think is so important. It's about problem solving. It's not, it's not about posture. It's really about solutions. And, you've been in this for 30 years. Must have been exciting to see how it has grown over time. So just a couple of questions that I would have. And I really, as you have seen this emerge, are there themes that you're understanding in community engagement? You know, it's such a new concept for so many people. What are we going to do with carbon dioxide permanent geologic storage? And to your point, you know, I know from my good friend Doug Burgum how much organization has come against building new pipelines coming in to North Dakota, where it's being used. Carbon dioxide is being used very successfully in enhanced oil recovery. So as you've seen over the 30 years, what is your sense of how people are addressing or thinking about carbon dioxide storage projects that go with it? And are there things that we can do to kind of address concerns before they sort of get off into the nether world of strange information and misinformation and so on?
Thanks for the question. When I first moved back to North Dakota in 1997, I worked for an organization called the North Dakota Consensus Council and developed projects to bring stakeholders and government officials together within North Dakota and regionally around energy and climate. And one of the things I learned in that experience is that the sort of official mechanisms we have for involving the public in project development and permitting, any number of things, regulatory, rulemaking, those mechanisms are essential for democracy. I'm not saying that they're bad. We have to have them, but they're the bare minimum of what we need for consultation in society to do big projects and move forward with things that involve big changes in people's lives. And I think historically people, you know, society's evolved. Even in my lifetime, people are more empowered, which is a good thing in some ways. They're certainly more mobilized because of technology, especially social media. And so the expectation of what's enough in terms of consultation is fundamentally changed, but the system hasn't kept up. And so the biggest thing we could change right now for the better would be timing. And that was part of what I referenced. And I want to be careful here. It's not my job. It's sensitive in Department of Energy to take a position on any particular project. But the Summit Pipeline is the one that they just had they had the North Dakota Public Service Commission, all elected, all Republican, and the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission, all elected, all Republican, deny their permits. That's unprecedented. These are traditional, conservative, growth-oriented regulatory bodies that have both issued within a month of each other denials of the siting permit. And I'm not making a dig at the company, but the project was very fully formed when landowners started hearing about it. Because engineering studies and other things had been done, the conversations in some instances, because of procedural rules that regulatory agencies have, started off with eminent domain. And so there were just so many things that were counterproductive. And so we will have the opportunity with other projects, both in our region and around the country, for a do-over. And I think what really needs to happen is there needs to be a real intentional effort to go to communities and stakeholders before the projects are fully finalized and in their engineering studies. It gets to a point where it's very costly to pull back and make fundamental changes to a project. If you start early enough, it's actually there's certain things you have to make money and the technology has to work. There's certain things you can't be flexible on, but there's an awful lot you can do to accommodate real concerns of communities. I saw that at siting one of the wind farms. We had some siting authority, our township, over the last wind farm that was built. And we used that to make sure that in the design of their project, they dealt with things like dust control and all these other things. And it worked. But it was done ahead of just kind of signing on the bottom line or the dotted line. So that would be the biggest thing, is to get ahead of this. And actually, my sense of Wyoming from afar is that you actually do that pretty well. you have the advantage that you also built a lot of CO2 pipeline infrastructure back in the day when the public wasn't as skeptical. As that's the other thing I would just say as a political observation. We're in a populist moment right now as a country. There's the populism you see on the conservative side that's very much in the movement around former President Trump, but then there's also the populism of the keep it in the ground, stop fossil fuels movement. And so we're seeing this manifest itself against projects on both sides.
Interesting. Are there questions? Yes.
And at that point in time, with renewables coming online and whatnot, obviously people started to recognize that to really fully incorporate renewables, we need a lot more critical mineral production. We need a lot more metals production than the world is currently, like factor of 10, more mining. And it's been, so at that point in time, I started, mentioned to my colleagues, well, minerals are an energy issue, not just a mining issue. And this has traditionally been in terms of the federal government, something that's been handled by the USGS in terms of finding, they've got their, I can't remember what it's called right now, but their big mining initiative where they're looking for new mineral deposits and whatnot. I was talking a couple of months ago to a colleague that's heavily involved in the USGS in terms of the minerals. And I'm wondering what sort of discussions, I know the DOE is proposing or getting a lot of research out there in terms of developing or looking at, coal ash and waste streams as a source of critical minerals. Is the DOE also in conversation with the USGS in terms of collaborating in developing new mineral resources?
Yes. So maybe just briefly share what you referenced. First of all, let me just say, I did not work on critical minerals before starting this job. And it's been I knew as a citizen our vulnerability at a high level, but there's things I know now that I could talk about, some of which I can't, which are that we are deeply vulnerable as a country. And it is, yes, our clean energy economy requires these minerals, and demand is going to skyrocket, but it's also national security, it's economic security, it's across the board. And it's not just production. In some cases, we still produce some minerals, but we've lost the capacity to process them. So we still would have to export them to other countries, actual raw ore to other countries for processing. It's a comprehensive problem. And we took way too long to focus on it. Within our office and our division of critical minerals, you are right, we are focused on recovering rare earths in particular, but critical minerals from coal waste, which is a very significant potential source in some parts of the country, acid mine drainage, produced water from oil and gas, mine tailings in some parts of the United States and parts of the world. The original mining was so inefficient from a technological standpoint that the tailings themselves are a target for minerals production. And the beauty of it is that with all these waste streams, it could create a commercial basis for investing in remediation that we don't currently have. You can think all over the West, there's all kinds of examples of mine waste and other legacy impacts of energy production before we had the regulatory requirements we have today, didn't have the technology we have today. To go back and address some of these legacy waste from a remediation standpoint and recover minerals is a huge opportunity. The R&D started in 2014, so it's now across 3 administrations. Thanks to the infrastructure bill, we're now able to take that R&D work and invest in the first stage of commercial scale processing. I'll share one quick example that's just illustrative. One of the FEED studies we awarded was in my own state of North Dakota, and that's for taking lignite coal and the clays in the overburden and processing them for rare earths recovery. But lot of, as you often find when you start doing R&D, you uncover things you didn't expect. Well, one of the things is that in that process that UNDERC is doing, they found out that gallium and germanium is precipitated out in significant quantities in some of the most expensive metals there are. So that's a bonus. And then the rare earth recovery is looking very good. And then the beneficiated lignite that's left over after the process, another company is doing R&D on turning that beneficiated lignite into products. And so they had a construction, a building brick made from lignite that required 1/10 of the energy of a kiln-fired clay brick. They also showed us battery-grade graphite made from lignite coal. So you can start to see from coal and waste streams the beginnings of recovering a position of resilience and independence. On new mining, though, it is absolutely necessary. And back to the permitting issue, it can't be that it takes 10, 12 to 20 years to permit a mine in this country. We will fall short of our clean energy goals. We'll also threaten our national security. But part of the problem, and you've all seen this, is there's a lot of anxiety about mining because of what happened in the 19th and early 20th century. And people assume that what happened in the past will therefore happen in the future. We need to change our mindset and take the same approach to technology that we do in energy technology and apply it systematically to mining. So minimum surface footprint, laparoscopic mining, in situ processing, so you don't have all this waste that you bring to the surface in the first place. We're even looking at net zero mining, where you take captured carbon emissions, CO2, and you mineralize ores, which locks up that CO2 forever. It also happens to liberate rare earths and other critical minerals to a degree, and so we're exploring and combine those two things. So there's a lot of exciting things. The other thing I'll just share with you, I know I'm taking too long here. I didn't know this coming into this job, that one of the most significant sources of energy use in the world today, and therefore CO2 emissions, is what is called rock comminution. I can't even say the word. I didn't know the word. It's the grinding of rock. It is literally, someone told me the CO2 emissions from grinding rock and mining is as large as aviation. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's a huge. And so that's another thing with the R&D we want to tackle, is to try to make that process more efficient.
Well, thanks, Brad. And I know we have one more. Okay. He had given me a great segue for permanent, but there's Randall.
Well, thank you. And I would allow someone else to ask a question, but
And I'll try to be quicker in my answers.
Assistant Secretary, thank you. And this may come as a shock to you, but sometimes we in the state get some mixed messages from DC. And yes, and even within the Department of Energy. And one of those deals with your sister program, the Office of Clean Energy and Development. They were a project proponent. Were recently told by a representative of them that if you have enhanced oil recovery as part of your end product with your storage, they will not fund it. I was real pleased to hear you say storage includes enhanced oil recovery. But do you have advice of how we deal between these kind of two conflicting philosophies out of DOE?
Let's follow up. I'd like to know who said that. So first of all, there is no federal funding or a tax credit for enhanced oil recovery. If we could accomplish one thing today, is to dispel this idea. Enhanced oil recovery is a decade-old technology process for recovering oil from depleted, but not fully depleted, oil and gas fields, where you're storing CO2 in the process. They call it associated storage, and getting more oil and gas out of those reservoirs. It is beneficial from a climate standpoint compared to conventional oil and gas production, because you're taking captured carbon emissions, using them to produce the oil, and a properly managed reservoir, that CO2 will remain permanently in the oil field, and whatever comes back up with the oil is separated out and re-injected. So, but EOR itself is fully commercial, so we are not doing R&D for conventional enhanced oil recovery, because there's no need to do that. The question then becomes, EOR, storing CO2 through EOR is in terms of law and regulation, an established pathway for geologic storage. EPA regulates it under Class 2. So, but it is also a source of conflict because there's a lot of criticism that you're just capturing CO2 to produce more oil. That's not actually true. That's not how it works in the industry, but that is the perception. And it was a point of contention within the administration. The way we handled it, and we worked with Congress, congressional staff from both parties, and we had a lot of dialogue within the department, is our position is that our EOR is not prohibited as a form of storage. But all things being equal, if you have two projects, one storing the CO2 through EOR and the other storing it in the saline formation, and they have essentially the same commercialization value, we will choose the project that has the greater climate benefit in a relative sense. But we are not prohibiting EOR as a pathway to storage. And then the DOE loan program has a policy understanding the challenges of getting Class 6 well permitted quickly. The DOE loan program's policy is they will provide a loan to a project that has a Class 2 permit for storage through enhanced oil recovery with the expectation that over time they shift to saline storage, but not standing in the way of getting the project off the ground. So I don't think where we're at is probably not where a state like Wyoming or North Dakota would want us to be. I'm be very honest about that. But, every administration has its priorities and different interests. And this is kind of where we came down to try to accommodate the concerns we were hearing from Congress and stakeholders, as well as the priorities of the administration.